Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to see you all.
Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Of
Yeah,
course.
we are so excited. This is episode 19. So,
Ooh,
yeah,
very exciting.
almost to 20 and this is on the serendipitous side. We're just hoping to connect all the readers to the authors that we love. We are so excited to have you on. This
Thank
is
you so much.
and oh, I'm Ashley, by the way.
I'm Emily.
Hello. I am Erin. It's nice to
Yeah,
meet you all.
for anybody who doesn't know, this is Erin Crosby Eckstine, the author of Junie. And for anybody who hasn't read, would you maybe give like a little synopsis?
Sure. So Junie is a coming of age story kind of at its heart, but as well as a Southern Gothic ghost story. It's kind of a mixture of those things. But Junie focuses on a 16-year-old enslaved girl named Junie, living on a plantation in Alabama just before the Civil War, who commits a desperate act that accidentally arouses her recently deceased sister's ghost, which then sets about a larger coming of age story and journey.
So good. Oh, I'm not usually a historical fiction kind of girl, but Em was like, no, you have to try this one. Just read it. And I could not put it down.
I really appreciate that. I would also like to point out that I really appreciate that I believe is that a black cat that just wandered across your lap?
This one's black and white. The black one is over on the bed.
I have the same combo in my home. My cat, I don't know where he went. He was just prowling directly in front of the computer, and then my husband lured him away. And then my black and white cat, she's a little shy, so she
Oh.
usually kind of just goes and she's not big on the Zoom interactions. We don't usually catch her for that, but there's a very good chance that my other cat will appear. He
I would
loves
love
to
that.
sit directly in front of the camera on Zoom.
Yeah,
Oh,
He loves doing that.
the tail right here where you're trying
Oh
to talk.
yeah, tail right in the middle, like half of his face blocking, whole sits on the keyboard, all of it.
animals
He's
are
he's all
so
about
Love
it.
it.
weird how they like that, some of them. So
They
strange.
do.
Yeah.
He loves being he wants to be the center of attention as often as possible. When I used to be a high school teacher and I would, the years I was teaching on Zoom, it was like a notorious thing with my students that I would just be in the middle of teaching. It's just like, oh well, there goes Miss Eckstein's cat. He's just sitting in front of the entire screen. I was like, yeah, he does that.
Funny.
That's hilarious.
I know.
And if you want to, too, if you want to give us like a little reading, no pressure, you
Sure.
don't have to.
Yeah, I would love to. So I will go ahead and dive into a little bit of Junie. I'm just going to read the first chapter because I
Awesome.
feel like it is, I feel like with readings every time I'm like, well, I don't want to read something way in there and then you don't even know what's going on. So I'll just read. I'm just going to pick it up in the first chapter. We have Junie wakes up in the red mud, listening to the water that slithers between the rocks in the creek. The faint first light of sunrise slips through the gray moss tangled between the black oak branches. The sun shines needle points warm her bare legs as mud cools her from below. The earth smell is enchanting after the rain, sharp, metallic, and sickening if you inhale too long, like copper pots on a humid day. The mud takes what should be hard and makes it soft, what should be finished and makes it raw. The distant crack of the foreman's whip tells her she's not supposed to be here. She can't get to her feet fast enough. Instinct makes her rub the wrinkles out of her moth-eaten nightdress, but in doing so, she coats it in a caked red mud until she is crimson streaked like Granddaddy's pants after he slaughters a pig. The whip cracks again. There is no time to fix it. August's humidity swarms her like yellow jackets. She runs, trying to ignore the pounding in her head and the stinging in her bare feet from stepping on cracked twigs and pointed rocks. The woods are thinning out now. She can see the field and the sun through the gap in the trees. She holds her hand up, measuring the sun's distance from the field line. It sits on the horizon like a freshly cracked yolk, and on days as hot as this one, the McQueens won't wake for breakfast until the sun's at least a half hand above the horizon. She has to make it to breakfast. She can't be late for breakfast. She promised Bess she'd help with the laundry, and knowing Bess, she's already been out since before day. It's another mistake, another lapse, another failure. Junie starts running again. Belrain Plantation, owned by the McQueen family, is stripped bare to make room for cotton fields, but the woods that frame the edges stay thick up to the banks of the Alabama River. She's memorized these woods as well as anyone can memorize something alive enough to change. Where the best blackberry bushes grow for Auntie Marilla's cobbler, the squeal the squirrels make when the hawks start circling, the creeks that sprawl like veins from the river, which hide the best skipping stones. Belrain is the only home she's known in her 16 years. Sometimes when she's running, she imagines that the branches and roots bend, allowing her to slip through like they know her too. The whip cracks again, this time too close to be the foreman's. Someone else is in the woods. It's still too far to the cabin for Junie to make a run for it. She can't stay on the ground. She has to get out of sight. She searches for a branch low enough to catch and hauls herself up onto the nearest oak tree, wincing as the bark cuts into her clammy palms. She climbs past layers of Spanish moss until the spider webs of dried plants hide her from the rusty forest floor, then leans her weight onto the trunk and covers her mouth with her blood-speckled palm. She's done some foolish things in her life, but falling asleep out here has got to be one of the worst. I'll stop there for.
Oh, that's a perfect intro. Thank you for reading for us.
Of course, happy to.
And so for anybody who hasn't read, again, because your author's note is phenomenal. But could you just talk about the inspiration for Junie a little?
Absolutely. So Junie is very loosely inspired by my actual ancestor and an actual family story. So it's loosely inspired by someone in my family referred to as Grandma Jane, who is for me my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother. I don't know how many it's a lot of greats, basically, a lot of great grandmas back. But she was this real person, and I often my grandmother would often tell me this particular family story all the time. She like repeat this story about this particular, ancestor we had. And for most of my childhood, I kind of like my grandmother was our family storyteller. She told so many stories about so many family members and was always repeating them, which I'm very thankful for now as an adult. And so this particular story that she told it to me many times throughout my life, but it didn't really stick with me, I feel like, until I was visiting my grandparents, I guess now about God, like 8 years ago. And my grandmother repeated the story, and at the time I'd read Isabella Allende's House of the Spirits, not too long before this. And I think just because it was like the most recent book floating around in my brain that I really loved, and then I heard my own family stories, it made me sort of have this moment of like, well, what if in the way that Allende kind of utilized her own family stories in creating this book, what if there was something there for some of my own? And all these stories I've been hearing all my life. So I ended up being kind of inspired by this initial story and utilizing that to kind of start off what I originally kind of had in mind as being more of like a multi-generational kind of family saga story. But ultimately, when I started working on the first ancestor, which ended up becoming Junie, it just gripped me so much. And I ended up having so much there that I was like, well, this is just its own thing now. Like Junie has taken on her life of her own, and this is its own thing. That was really the initial inspiration. But with the ancestor that we have, I won't give away all of what happened to her because a lot of it's a spoiler for the book. But the thing is, as is often very true for people with, enslaved ancestors and who are descendants of slavery, we don't really know much about those people when they were enslaved. You can't really get a lot of information just because that wasn't documented. They didn't document anything really about enslaved people. So there was nothing really there. So everything that I really knew about this woman, I knew about from after slavery, after she was enslaved. So I think in a lot of ways too, in writing this book, it was somewhat me kind of like envisioning what like her life was a little bit in that space that we don't know anything about. Obviously, I also like added in ghosts, so like it took on a life of its own. But it was a very that ended up becoming kind of a lot of the inspiration point there. The real Junie, or Grandma Jane, she actually lived to be well over 100. The real woman lived to be well over 100, and she only died because she got hit by a horse and buggy crossing the street.
Oh
So
my
she was,
gosh.
yeah, she was wild. Yeah, Jane Cotton, she really hung in there, which is insane if you think about where her life started. I mean, and if you've read the book, you also know other things about what happened in her life. And I think it's pretty, I think when I was growing up, when I was a kid, that was always the thing that got me. That was just like this woman lived. I had this ancestor who lived to be like insanely old and only died because I think apparently she was carrying a cake across the street, got hit by a horse and buggy. Um,
Wow.
yeah,
Oh,
but she was a pretty incredible woman. Even from the little bits of, family lore that I had learned about her and little bits I could kind of trace in a lot of ancestral records. It's again, it was pretty tough. Most of what I could then kind of trace about her when I was really looking for it were a lot of like census records and that kind of thing where she would pop up.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, again, not a lot of documentation in that era of enslaved people and formerly enslaved people. But that was really the sort of the initial spark of the book was this family story.
So cool. So around what age were you when you knew that you wanted to start writing this book?
This book in particular, so I started Junie when I was, how old was I? 25. I was 25 when I started it. I definitely never had thought I would write a book about slavery. I think I say that in my author's note even. I never thought that was the direction I was going to end up going in. I did not feel like something that, I was not something I would have bet on about myself necessarily. I don't think that that was what I thought I was going to do. Um, but really, I was just very inspired at that point by this particular family story. And it made me, I think I have always really loved like intergenerational kind of family stories. And I've always really loved magical realism. Like those are just two kind of genres I've always been very into, amongst others. And the family saga kind of stories in particular was like something my grandmother and I really shared. We like my grandmother, I feel like, is the person who really made me love reading and love stories and love books more than like I think probably more like if I have to think all of my family is readers. I come from a big family of readers, which I'm very thankful for. My grandmother was probably the most sort of like passionate fiction reader in my family and the person who loved reading in that way the most. And so she was really the one who instilled a lot of that in me. And she and I would kind of like constantly like trade books. And we're often like, my grandmother would always tell me I was giving her homework because I was a high school English teacher and I would like show up with books for her all the time. So she and I always loved those kind of stories. So I think in some ways when I got this idea, it was kind of something that felt very connected to like my family, my story personally, my interest personally, in a way that like other ideas that I'd had in the past didn't. Like I think if there's anything that I'm sort of have learned with working on this book and other books is that it really is often when you're writing like the thing that feels the most sort of like personally tied to you, that feels like a story that you're the only one who could probably write that thing, or feels like this is so ingrained in who you are, like that is often the story to go pursue and try to write, even if it's like scary or that I think is often important because sometimes I feel like prior to working on Junie, when I would sort of write stuff and like not finish it, it was often that I felt like whilst it would be tied to me in some ways, I was often trying to like write towards what I thought was a cool idea. Like I would often kind of be
Yes.
writing towards more like, oh, I think other people will like this, or like, oh, this concept is kind of cool, but it doesn't necessarily super, um, it didn't have necessarily the depth of connection to me specifically. Not that I think every book has to have that, but like, I think the part of the reason that Junie became something that it has, and that it's been something where I was like, I finished it and it has turned into the book that I was able to publish and do all these things with, was I think a little bit because it was so like very personally connected to my like it was very much a story that in many ways I was kind of the only person who could tell because it was very much about like
That makes
my very specific family.
totally makes a lot of sense. And that's great advice for writers.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's tough because, when you're I also teach writing as well. Like I that's what I do in addition to writing. And I think a lot of times when I'm sort of coaching my own students and going through things that's often kind of what I'm often getting at is like trying to pursue things that feel scary, that feel very personal, that feel like you're the only person who can really tell them, or that you can tell them in an incredibly unique way and perspective. I think is often where the most sort of like honest and interesting books come from, rather than trying to like, be your favorite author or like trying to like write to something that's going on in the market or like write, whatever, that
Mhm.
kind of thing.
Totally.
so how did you land on Junie's age? Was she ever any other age?
Junie was always about that age, I think. I did for a few reasons. I think primarily part of it was that whilst I didn't really know how old my ancestor was exactly, because again, not clear records, I think I settled on that because that seemed like an approximate of probably how old she was, just like based on loose math. I was like, that seems probably right. And then on top of it, I put her really in that age category, I think, because I knew I wanted this to be a coming of age story. I also was a high school teacher, so I spent my life surrounded in teenagers. Just that was my life. So many teenagers all the time. So I think to me as well, I have always really, I knew teenagers very well. I've always been very interested in sort of like the adolescent experience and adolescence in general. And I was very intrigued, I think, in placing this story in the perspective of a teenager for that reason. Teenagers are so interesting in the sense that like you really are on the cusp of so many things. They have such specific brain chemistry going on at that, all of us have such specific brain chemistry going on at that time in our lives. And that was a lot of what I also wanted to dig into is the fact that like societal expectations for teenagers have dramatically changed, obviously, since like 1860, but brain chemistry of being 16 has not changed since 1860. Like human brains have not changed since 1860. We are doing the same stuff. So a lot of what I wanted to do in the book was sort of like explore what I knew to be true about an adolescent's, brain chemistry and the choices that teenagers just make because that's just what their brains are doing at that time. That's just what it is. But apply that to this particular situation. So I think for me, that was a lot of why I put Junie at the age that she is. I wanted Junie to be a teenager. I wanted her to be like really bad risk-taking decisions. Like I wanted her to be like, making really bad risk-taking decisions. I wanted her to be moody. I wanted her to like, feel like she knows more about the world than she really does. I wanted her to like kind of just like engage with all the things that we often know to be true about teenagers and kind of like throw that into this particular environment because ultimately like it was just something I'd never seen before. I'd never seen that kind of representation within this time period. Or if you did see characters who were teenagers or who were really young, it often felt like that wasn't like an emphasized point of their characterization. It was more so just like, let's just emphasize how young people were in these circumstances. And it's like horrifying. And that could often be part of it, but a lot of times it didn't feel like you were also necessarily emphasizing like, oh, this character who's a teenager is also going to operate like one. Like they are still going to act like one because that's just what their brain chemistry is doing. Like it's not like that it's just how the brain is developed at that age. And so that was a lot of what I wanted to get into with Junie. It's funny. I feel like sometimes some of the like more critical feedback I get for Junie sometimes is that people are like, Junie is just a mess. Junie spends too much of her time. She makes horrible decisions. I could never deal with this person. She's making so many stupid choices. Why is this character so ridiculous? And then I'm always like, as the author, I always come in, I'm like, because she's 16. Like, and I think a lot of people who read it, it's like we have a conception, which makes sense. It's like when you are reading about this time, we know how harrowing and horrific and dangerous this time period is and how dangerous her situation is because we are sitting here, 100 something years later. We know all of this raw depth of history. But for Junie, what I often kind of think about is like Junie has lived her entire life on this one plantation. She doesn't know anything about anything else. She really does not have a conception necessarily of what sorts of horrors could be going on other plantations. She doesn't really know. She has a sense of essentially the little bubble that she lives in, and she's a teenager. So like even if like, as we see her own relatives will try to relate to her that these things are dangerous and that they know more than she does. I don't know about you, but like, I didn't always listen to my elders tell me about stuff when, how many of us when we were teenagers were like, they tell you don't do that thing and you just ran off and did the thing. That's like standard teenager behavior. So I was like, and I knew this again, I was a teacher. So I was very aware of like the number of times you could tell a kid not to do something. And then I'd go find out that there were kids throwing shoes off of the highway overpass. Like that was the kind of thing that was just a daily part of my life. So again, I think sometimes I almost have to recontextualize when I have readers who come in and are just like, I don't get what's going on with this character. And then I'm like, oh, right. I was a high school teacher. I spent all of my time around kids like this. this is very much for me. I'm like, yeah, this is like standard teenager nonsense. Like her running off and hiding in the woods when that's obviously stupid is like, yeah, that's again, I literally had kids who I cannot overstate one day spent a day after school throwing shoes on the highway. Like that is like
Oh my God.
because they thought it would be funny. Or I had a
Yeah.
kid one time. I had one time I was sitting in the hallway on hallway duty, and a child ran out, had stolen a gallon of milk from the school kitchen, was running down the hallway, threw the gallon of milk in the middle of the hallway, then threw themselves on top of the milk, and then had no less than 20 kids filming them for TikTok. And I
I
was
remember
yeah, and
that
I
was
was
a
the person
thing.
on duty for that. Yeah, and that was me. I was the teacher on duty to deal with that.
Uh-huh.
So like these are the things that like I feel like there's a certain level of being a high school teacher where you see it all like yeah, kids getting into like a fight in the middle of English class and you're like, what are you doing? Like you're in or I had a kid who padlocked two other kids' shoes together in the middle of my class once. I can go on and on forever. Like I have stories that could literally go on and on till the end of
Oh my.
time of teenage nonsense. And like that is what it is like and so that's to me
Yeah.
again Junie to me I'm like whilst I didn't put her to that kind of teenage nonsense I did want to have some level even like there's a point in the book where her and another character like race to climb a tree like to me that's a very teenager nonsense thing to do it's like should you be doing that probably not that's not really a good decision based on your situation in life but you're going to do it because you're teenagers and teenagers are insane and so
I
this
loved that
is
part
yeah
too.
I
it
remember being insane when I was a teenager still. I mean, and I'm not, it's been a long time since I was a teenager, but I remember like none of it felt crazy to me because teenage years are wild and your frontal lobe's not developed, like you said, and all the things. But that was one of the things I really liked that you spoke on at the end of the book about how you wanted to write Junie as an enslaved character with a full spectrum of emotions and well rounded because that's something you don't see portrayed so often. That stuck with me so much. Like I thought about that so much after I read that you had written that.
thank you yeah that was very important to me just because like I said I definitely like read other books I've read a good number of books that have been set during this time period in various ways some of them I read just before I worked on Judy some of them I read while working on Junie and in each of the cases it often to me felt like there are kind of like two camps that a lot of books on enslaved people fall into, which is like you either get the very like literally gone with the wind level perspective, where it's like the enslaved people are so happy to be here and are just having a grand old time with being enslaved, which is always a real fun one. Or you get the or even something like maybe even more of like a Huckleberry Finn situation where there's like an emphasis on they're probably not happy, but also still again not really a person. Like, we're not getting a fully well-rounded Jim out of Mark Twain necessarily. Or you sort of get the alternative where you have a lot of much more, I think, definitely more realistic accounts and more, on the money accounts, but oftentimes in depicting the scale of the horror that happened to people, I think that there can also be a distancing from a lot of those people's individual characterizations and individual flaws, choices, senses of self, and those kinds of things. Like, I think that we oftentimes can lose a sense of those characters' sort of like ambitions and what their dreams are, what their flaws are, what they are thinking, the full complexity of them as a human being. The what's so interesting, honestly, is that I said that, and that was the reason behind writing Junie. And then earlier this year, I finally read James, and I was like, oh, well, if this book existed before I wrote Junie, then I probably wouldn't have written Junie. I was like, I probably wouldn't have written this. I probably wouldn't even
I
bother.
literally was thinking in my mind while you were talking that I visualized y'all's covers next to each other. Like they should be required reading together. What an amazing book that is.
James is
Oh
incredible.
my God.
It was incredible.
Totally
It
as
was the first.
incredible as Junie. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. James was one of those where that was literally the feeling I had. I read it and I was like, oh, I wouldn't have written my book if this
Yeah.
existed
I
when
feel
I
like
was writing it. I
in
was like,
no
I just want to
way
move on.
to generalize because there's so much difference between them, but
Yeah.
they're like sister books in a way. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? They both tell, and also what amazing audio narration. Did you listen to the audio on James?
On James, I listen. I
It
think
is
I listened to bits of
so
it. I
good.
did.
Yes,
Yeah,
it
I
is.
think I listened to bits of it. I have a tendency to, I kind of like jump between audio and the physical sometimes, just depending on what I'm doing in my life.
We do the same thing.
I tend to do that sometimes. So I'm trying to remember. I think I did audio it a little bit, maybe. But I read it. I remember I like kind of devoured it earlier this year because in a way, I think James was not, what, James came out in like 2024. So like James came out after I'd finished writing Junie. Like Junie was in production. It was, it was out of my hands entirely by the time it came out. And then I didn't read it, I think, for a good chunk of time just because I didn't get around to it, even though I knew it was supposed to be great. I just didn't make it. I didn't get around to it. And then in some ways too, I feel like when you write a book on a particular subject or something that's very, sometimes it kind of, it's interesting as a writer for me. Sometimes like if there's another book out there that somebody writes around the same time as yours that's like very similar to yours, that you can kind of go in two directions of either being like, I'm definitely going to go read this and explore what they did, or sometimes you're like, I need to take a step away from the subject matter and I'm actually going to not read this right now and I'm going to like come back to this at another point. So I think for James, I like I didn't get around to finally reading it until like the end of last year, beginning of this year, but it was so good. Like I was just like, oh, this is incredible. Like this is definitely, I feel like Percival Everett had a similar set of objectives in some ways to what I was kind of trying to go for a little bit with Junie, in a way that I really, really loved. And I was like, and he's such just like a masterful author, such an incredible, incredible author that I was really, I really, really loved it.
Yeah, y'all
I
both.
haven't read it yet, so
Oh,
it's on my bookshelf.
it's so good.
So
Yeah.
good. It really is.
That's
It's so good. And
what
like
I'm
you don't
picking up.
really, I've never read Huckleberry Finn. I never had to read it in school. I never really came across it, but like you don't, it is interesting. Like I looked it up a little bit as I was reading it just because I'm like a book nerd and want to know more stuff. But I don't feel, you don't really need it. Like you don't really need the context of Huckleberry Finn particularly for it. But it's really incredible. I think he does so many masterful,
Oh man.
awesome things in it
Oh
that
my
I was
God.
really impressed with.
I've never spoken to anyone who didn't like the book that read it.
Yeah, I haven't either.
What type of reader you are. Oh, I out of every book I read that year, it was in my top five. I was
Yeah.
floored. I read it three times.
Yeah,
I
that's
love it.
valid, honestly. Like that is valid. There were some parts in there where yeah, I was like,
I was
oh,
like, I
this
have
is
to read
yeah.
this.
I understand why this book has won every award a book can
Yeah,
win. I was like, I get it. I
yeah,
was like,
yeah,
that's fair.
yeah,
Like I was like, I read it, I was like, yeah, all right,
yeah,
I got, yeah,
yeah,
he deserved that one.
yeah. Ah, that's good.
I know. So good. I really love that one.
Me too.
And with your characters too, even the not great people, they still had redeeming qualities. And what is it that made you make I don't want to say make everybody likable because some of them are definitely not,
Mhm.
but what made you give them a little something positive?
I think for me in that it goes back to I guess a slightly similar philosophy to like writing a main character in the case that I had who was going to be like clearly flawed and clearly have issues was that I find that even in writing characters who are ultimately going to do evil things, it is very helpful. I think it's still it's a lot more interesting when you can feel a sense of them being grounded in some level of like logic and choice that you can kind of understand or that you could almost empathize with. And in some ways, I think that that is a big part of sort of the writing process and being an author as well, that like it's your characters are not going to come 100% come across if you always write your bad characters to just be so bad with no sense of how they're redeeming themselves, because then in a lot of ways like even bad people rarely go about it being like, I am a villain and I'm bad. Like they themselves think that they're doing things. They are themselves saying, well, like, here's the reason why I'm doing this thing. I'm actually not that, most people are not trying to, go about life being evil. or they are trying to find some way to rationalize their own behavior and whatever. So that was some of what I wanted to get into. And I also just wanted to get into, I think for a lot of the characters, the complexities of this horrible social hierarchy that they are all existing in. When I think about a character like Violet, who's the master's daughter, Violet is the character I wanted to, in many ways, write with a lot of that complexity because with Violet, I when you think about the antebellum South, it is really was like a wonderland for straight rich white men. That was the entire concept to me of the antebellum South. It was like Disneyland for being a straight landowning white guy.
Yeah.
They were at the top of the hierarchy. They got to exist with basically no rules. They had essentially nothing that really governed their behavior in any meaningful way beyond just like, basic like country laws, like basic United States laws. But beyond that, they basically could just do whatever they wanted. They had complete control over their plantations. If they owned their plantations, there was no sense of, anything of what they could do on their plantations. They could be as, they could be as, as moral, quote unquote, as they wanted while still being slave owners, or they could be as diabolically evil as they wanted to, and there was no repercussions and there was nothing that was going to happen to them. But for anyone else who wasn't that, there was something in place that was holding them in place. And so, for example, like white women in these cases had their own sets of, hierarchy that they were operating within. These women had like no real power in their life. These women were essentially, it's like you're getting married off. Like your entire situation is that you exist to be in this incredibly, sort of traditional domestic role where you have to play a very specific you have to be a very specific type of person. You have to be married off when people tell you to get married off. You have no real control over your life. You have no real ability to do much of any, like they didn't have anything going on. Like these white women also were very, very, controlled within their situation. Like the patriarchal setup here also gave them pretty much no power, except over the enslaved people, which is where this then rolls on and we often see in Junie. But so in Violet's case, I think I wrote Violet to again be a character who's not really fitting the mold of what she's supposed to be doing as like a quote unquote Southern belle, right? Like she's supposed to be essentially Scarlett O'Hara. Like that's kind of the expectations of the direction she should be going in many ways, is to be this specific type of woman. And then or maybe not even Scarlett O'Hara, maybe more like Melly or something. I think Melly is honestly a better in Gone with the Wind is probably a better sum up of what they're supposed to be, is just like docile and lovely and sweet and just having no opinions on anything. And I think part of what I wanted to include with Violet's character is seeing how she herself is so penned in by the expectations of her world and how much she can't really do anything. And then how, therefore, though, because she has more power than Junie, how ultimately she utilizes the power that she does have in a way that ends up being harmful to others. Like we see how that dynamic kind of comes into play. And that was a lot of what I was sort of interested in with a lot of these characters, was the dynamics of power and the power sort of like hierarchy and structure on these plantations and how that really operated, and how we see people who are disempowered in different ways operating within the amounts of power then control that they have. So that was a lot of what I was very intrigued by in doing this, which is why I think I wrote a lot of these characters to have these complicated places and relationships. Violet being, I think, most of all by far, because Violet does consider in many ways Junie to be her best friend. Like she thinks of that relationship as one of friendship, that they are close, that they have, that they have this special bond or kind of things. But obviously the whole thing that the story really is getting into is like, can you really be in a loving relationship with someone you own? Which is the answer is no. So like that was a lot of what I wanted to sort of explore and get into. And then similarly on Junie's perspective, because again, Junie is basically like, this is kind of my only friend. Even though she sort of knows that it's not 100% really that. Again, it's like, can I really trust someone? Can I really have a meaningful relationship with someone who owns me? Again, no. So that's the that was a lot of what I wanted to kind of explore and get into, is the sort of genuineness of emotions, but how the systems that are in place make it so that some of the Joe's genuine feelings are not capable of existing and being expressed, really.
Yeah, that hierarchy of power and lack of agency. I was talking to Emily at my high school failed me because when that came up for Violet, I was like, oh shit. Like
Yeah.
this is there's so much more to this than I thought. And I mean, it's embarrassing that I hadn't previously thought of that, but you did a phenomenal job. I
Thank
mean,
you. And no,
they're
and I think it's like super valid to not know a lot of stuff about this time period and these things. Like, we don't get good educations on this in high school.
So
Like, we
sad.
don't receive, and it also so varies on this country, on where did you go to high school? Where in the country did you grow up?
That's what we talked about because I had an incredibly enriched history of high school because I grew up in Mississippi and I had a black man as a teacher and his
There you go.
slaves, and he taught us about real history not written by a white man. So
There
I
you
was
go.
incredibly lucky, but that's not how most people learned about it. Yeah.
No,
yeah.
and I would have, I don't know where I traced something, but again, like I went to high school in California. So I was in California. I was probably, by the time I was learning this, I was in APUS. So I was learning whatever they wanted us
Right,
to know
right,
for that
right.
test. Probably I was learning, I was in there for A push. So I was probably learning that. And I think a lot of the things that I ended up learning about this period, there's so much stuff that I only learned in researching for this book. There are a lot of things that I learned because, frankly, like my whole family, I was born in Alabama and I had all this family in Alabama. My family is very into history. My mother is a historian. My mom's a historian. My grandmother was a home ec and history teacher. So my family's like real into it goes way back. So a lot of things I honestly learned about the time period too, just because like my family was just kind of like into history and would just kind of like drag me and make me go see stuff and learn about things. And that was just kind of part of it. So there were a lot of things that I feel like I learned just because my family was interested in them. Um, and then I learned certain things in school, but a lot of it, honestly, there are just a lot of things that I didn't really pick up or completely get and understand until I was fully working on this book in a lot of ways. There's a lot of stuff a lot of mostly deeply, deeply horrifying things. Like, I think most of what I learned, unfortunately, like in working on this book, was honestly how watered down the history of slavery is that we learn in school, like how profoundly watered down it is. That is really, I think, the more, because honestly, I think that if they taught the fullest level of the stuff that happened to a lot of people in these, I don't, it's like things that are beyond what the mind can even cope with in terms of horror. Um, in some cases, and
Especially at that age.
Yeah.
especially at that age, in some ways, like I think that there are some things that fall into that category. It's like I think it's necessary that people do honestly learn how horrific things really were in a lot of cases. But again, I think a lot of what I again come back to and think about a lot with this structure, like with this history, and what to me is really terrifying about it is the fact that like it was entirely governed by the morality of the slave owner. So like you are dealing with a situation where it's like it was just up to what that guy thought was okay. Like that is literally it. That was pretty much that was the governing situation, was just like whatever he thinks is okay is what's going to happen. So
Yeah.
it's like because you do hear accounts, of course, where you have some accounts of enslaved people who are like, oh, the master wanted me to learn how to read and like freed me and eventually taught me how to do, you get some accounts where you're like, oh, that sounds like a slightly more humane, that is quote unquote more humane than other situations, quote unquote, right? Like you can hear some accounts that sound like that. Obviously, still not, because you're enslaving someone, not going to ever be good. But they have, yeah, exactly. But they have some accounts that sort of give off that. And again, that really just came down to who that person was. Like
Yeah.
that just came down to who that the master was, and the fact that for whatever reason, that was just the kind of person they were. While in other circumstances, you hear about, if you think about the most horrifying and depraved, horrific things you have ever heard of a person doing, like ever, that was what was happening on these plantations. Because again, what if you took the most horrific things that we know people are capable of doing and removed any guardrails, like
Right.
removed any sense that they were ever going to face consequences for what they've done. Um, at least when we hear to some extent sometimes about horrifying crimes that people commit and horrifying things people do, it's like, they might be held responsible That's something. If these were people they were never going to be held, there was no chance that they
And
were
they
ever going
knew
to be held
that.
responsible. And
And
they
they
knew that.
knew that.
And they were operating that way. They knew that nothing would happen to them for what they were doing and how
Terrified.
they were behaving. And that the people that they were doing this to were essentially not legally considered people. So that to me is often how I try to describe the breadth of it. Is like think of the worst thing you could possibly imagine a human being doing, and then imagine how many people would do that if they also had no consequences
Mm-hmm.
and they
Like
were
a free
aware
for
that they,
all.
yeah. And that was basically what's happening. Like that was happening for 200 something years in this country, was essentially those types of places. And it wasn't happening on every single plantation, but it was happening on many of them. And and there's not really a good way of knowing, what was the sort of like average level of what was going on.
Yeah.
No, they're
I
not all keeping records, I don't think.
No, they don't. Yeah, exactly. They're not keeping records of these things. They're not keeping up with any of that. I learned there are all I think Toni Morrison's Beloved does a good job of kind of indicating some of this as well. I think at certain points where like in the narrative in Beloved at the beginning, when they often talk about the plantation where they're enslaved, the master is initially like relatively like not benevolent, again, kind of a weird word when you're talking about enslavement, but it's not a super, in the very beginning of the story, it is not a super heavily violent place. It's really the place that is described is not that really that vibe. They are enslaved and forced to work and forced to do these things, but you're not seeing a level of unrelenting physical violence in the same way in the beginning of Beloved. What changes though in Beloved is that there's a turn in which the essentially the power structure changes, in which the slave owners hire a new overseer who is completely evil and
Yes.
completely insane. And that is what changes the dynamic. And I think that to me is also something, again, that comes up in Junie of like, that is what was the big, also massive factor in these people's lives, was just that like you could be in a relatively quote unquote benevolent situation where you were in a relatively, even in James, that kind of comes up in the very
Yeah.
beginning, where you're sort of in like a relatively like, okay, like sort of okay, not again, still bad, but like not the sort of peak level of horrifying violent situations. But it's just these little moments that could change everything, where it's like, oh, um, you know, I've decided to sell you because I can. Because somebody offered me a lot of money that sounded good, so I'm going to sell you. Or, oh, this person, we need a new overseer because the old overseer died, so we got to go. The overseer left, so we need to hire someone who is, insane. Like so the daughter got married off, and now there's a new master. All of these situations can
Yeah.
happen, and that is the factor that I think is the most horrifying to me. It's like how these decisions and these things that have absolutely nothing to do with your life can just come like dramatically,
Absolutely.
completely upend and destabilize it all. So that was, and in Junie, I do explore that quite a bit. I think
Yes.
that's a big part of the
Yes.
story.
That was one of the things that stuck out to Ash so much about it when we talked about it, was that exploration of the destabilizing based off just marriage, reproduction, any whim, whatever. I mean,
Yeah, I felt like it.
people, whatever the hell they wanted to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really like that. I don't really like that maid. Like,
Okay.
yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Like, it really, I was just like, cause you could. I mean,
Yeah.
you see, James does a fantastic job, again, just shouting out this book endlessly, of showing that we're like,
In case
in
y'all
the course
haven't read yet.
in the course of like a 300-page book, James gets sold like 6 times, I think. Like he gets sold
Yeah.
at least. I don't even know at a certain point how many times
Yeah.
he seems to exchange hands, and like what is a situation that you should not have that happen. But again, it's a really good indicator of what this situation was like, as well as just the complete disempowerment, and also just the complete lack of regulations around any of it, that people were just like pretending to own people, didn't even own them. Like, it's just crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So that was,
so
I think with Junie, similarly, that was in a lot of pieces what I was also very kind of interested in digging into and exploring.
Yeah. It's so thought provoking.
Yeah, thank you. It was a lot. Yeah, it was a lot to ponder and think about. And I think too, I'm a big 19th century novel nerd. That's like my thing. And I've read so many of these 19th century British novels, and I studied a lot of European history. My mom's a European history professor, so
Wow.
I know a lot about European history. both because I'm personally interested in it and because my mother will just tell me about it at length at any time. And so so I know a lot about the structures. So in many ways, it was also kind of, I think, interesting to me to see the ways in which the plantation system in the United States is really just like a transplantation of
Yeah.
they really just kind of transplanted like European feudalism onto the quote unquote, onto the American South, but just did it in like a decidedly they didn't have, a peasant class in the way that they do in Europe.
Hmm.
Uh, so they were just like, we'll just enslave people and make them do that and create a far worse dynamic. But the structure of it is quite similar in many ways to what was going on in Europe and sort of how that sort of like, you know, feudal structure worked, except in the European context, they did actually have, I mean, the lowest classes did in fact actually have like decidedly more freedom going on. They had a significantly better circumstance. But it was a that to me has also been kind of an interesting pairing and structure to look at throughout, and how so many of these people who were plantation owners in America were often the actually like lower classes, or sort they weren't the gentry class of Europe. They were the people who weren't a part of that world and weren't in that higher classes, and they come to America in whatever way they do, and essentially are like, well, if I'm here, I can finally be like one of those people that, the people who are the highest up back where I came from, I can now pretend to be them here using this structure, and how much of that became
Yeah.
a lot of it as well.
How did you protect your headspace while you were writing this? Like,
That's, that's a great question. I think I it's funny. I don't 100% know exactly what I was doing to attempt to protect it. I think I definitely had some days where like I would read across something and just it was like so awful that I would just kind of have to like take a little step away for a while and go like air out my brain somewhere. Go
yeah,
like, I don't know, stare at the television or something.
touch
I
grass.
go touch grass somehow. It was in whatever way I could. But I think at the same time, I think I felt like a necessity of persevering through it in some ways, because I was like, one, these were real people's lives. And, and two, I think because it was something that was linked to my own family and my own family stories, it felt very important to me to just like keep going. Um, because I was like, well, this is like my own real ancestry. And, this is my one enslaved ancestor that I'm particularly writing about. This is one of them, but I'm like, I have a lot of enslaved ancestors. All sides of my family have enslaved ancestors involved. This is just the one particular ancestor that uh, that I know a little bit more about and that I'm basing this particular story on. So to me, it was sort of like, I felt like I had to sort of witness it to some extent and be there, because I was like, this is ultimately what I come from. Like all of my, I am a descendant of American slavery on every single possible corner inside. That's what my mom and dad are both descendants from. So that's what it comes from, that's what we're in. So it to me in some ways felt like a necessary, I think in some ways for me, I'm like, well, this is where we came from. This is where everything in my bloodline comes from. And that's what I have to kind of, sit with and kind of learn about and manage and write in this. It felt like it had like some purpose, I guess, in doing
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. So when you were writing Junie, and obviously I'm trying to avoid spoilers, so I know we have to be careful about this question, but did you always know that the ending would be ambiguous?
I did always know that the ending was going to be, to some extent, the way the ending is. I had a different iteration of the ending. That if you read my author's note, I explain a little bit. If you read the book and you read the author's note, I explain why the endings are what the ending is. Because there is the ending of the book is, and the way I ended it was always going to be based on what was the real thing that happened. The
Right.
ending is really steeped in the actual thing, the actual story, the actual thing that happened. And it's funny, I initially wrote the book to have the real ending, the real things that happen. And many stakeholders involved in my book were like, nope, you can't do that. And we're like, basically, a lot of stakeholders were kind of like, this will be so like this is like basically for the sake of the narrative in this case, we need to pivot this to being a different type of thing. And honestly, the ending that the book has is honestly like a compromise ending in many ways that I had with a lot of different people because I wanted it to go in the more realistic direction, and a lot of people wanted me to go in a completely different direction with it, which I can't get into without giving things away. And it ended up sitting at ambiguity, I think became the compromise point in a lot of ways. Um, and I think that for me, I wanted in many ways for it to end with as close to the real as possible because the real thing was just it was again it was that was what would happen, and to me it felt necessary to honor the actual experience of what really did happen and like what really occurred and what that meant for the real people that this happened to. That was to me what was meaningful. But I also, I was able to kind of like understand to some extent when you're working with like a book and working with narrative and trying to do things, how that lands and how that goes. And it's so funny because to this day, the number of people I get who are very mad at me about the ending, and I'm like, that's the nice ending, y'all. Like
Yeah,
I put in the
all the
I
way.
put in a I put in a different ending than I really initially wrote. Like this is a different thing than what was the real. And I was like, I think if I wrote I think the takeaway of many of the people involved in my book was basically like, if you put in the real situation here, you are going to so like reader, like the level of whatever the upset about the ending response that I got to what it currently is would have been like, I don't even know how much more so. So to me though, again, I was like, that to me feels like that was how this kind of was, and that's sort of what I wanted it to sit with. But I'm very happy with where it landed. I think where it landed has still been a good place to kind of work with addressing those emotions and those feelings and bringing up a lot of what I wanted readers to feel at the end, which is a lot of that sort of the feelings that people tend to get at the end of the book.
Yeah.
But I did always know it was going to land. I always wanted it to land with those kinds of feelings and emotions. And for Junie to end where she does is very much what I wanted because it was honoring the real ancestor and the real thing that
Absolutely.
happened.
Yeah.
The narration for your audiobook too is just phenomenal.
I
Angel
know.
Ping does a great job.
She's so good. She's so fantastic. I feel like she really brought it to life in such a beautiful way. I also listened to another book that she narrated recently, Dominion by Addie Kitchens. Highly recommend.
Oh,
Very, very
it's
good.
so
So good.
good.
So good. Oh, you're from Mississippi too, so you
Yeah.
really are gonna love
Yeah.
that one. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say
Oh, yeah.
yeah, it's so good. And
So,
and Angel narrates that one too, and it was incredible.
oh,
Angel is just such a phenomenal narrator.
Did
yeah.
you get like auditions and then like get to pick?
Sort of, yeah. So basically you don't get like them auditioning your book, but you get like the essentially the audiobook. It's kind of a similar thing with the cover art too.
Hmm.
Essentially the publisher will come to you and be like, here are some options that we think would be a good fit for this. And you look at your options and they're like, listen to, so like they would gave me like, some little clips of a bunch of different audiobook narrators narrating other stuff. And I would have to kind of like sit there and listen to their voices and like decide. So I chose Angel. Basically, I think it was like I had to do it and I had to rank them. So, because, you never know if someone's unavailable or whatever. And Angel was my first choice. I remember listening and being like, that's the voice that I like the best. Like, that one's definitely the one I went with. And then Angel ended up doing it, which was amazing. So, you end up kind of like ranking people and going with that. And then cover art is a kind of similar situation where they sent me a few different artists that they were like, these are some artists that we think could be good fits, and they send you like their Instagrams or their sort of like catalogs of their work and stuff like that. And so you go and look. I know I went and looked through it, and then the same thing happened with Sarah Madden, who is the cover artist for Junie. Where similarly I looked up her art and you would kind of look at a couple of these different things and I was like, oh, this is the art that I personally like more. Like I like this vibe. And then essentially they will hire the people, they will send them, obviously the book and whatever, and then they come back with what they're going to do. So in the case of the cover art, because I often get a lot of people who talk about how much they love the cover, and I'm always like, I really cannot take any credit for this
Gorgeous.
because like it's such a beautiful cover. Like I
So
absolutely
pretty.
love it. But the way that this sort of came together is that literally I saw Sarah's art and I was like, I really like this. And then they just sort of like, okay, cool. They sent off the book to Sarah, and like a few weeks later, all of a sudden Sarah comes back with like two mock-ups of possible covers, this being one of them. And like everyone started crying when they saw this one. So then we were like, I think that's the one because everyone keeps crying. Uh, and so that was, this is just literally like she just came back with this. Like this is just what showed up in my email inbox. And I was like, well, this is a
Wow.
masterpiece. This is
Oh my
fantastic. We're
gosh.
absolutely doing this.
It's gorgeous. It's one of the prettiest
Yeah.
covers of all time. I'm serious. I
It's
love it so much. I literally keep it displayed in my dining room. Like the book is up all the time with like pink candles around it. I love
yeah.
it so much.
It just turned out so
Yeah,
beautiful. Like she just did such an incredible job. And this was just what showed up.
yeah,
Like, that's pretty much really what it was. And then we did a couple of like color options. So there is also like a nighttime version that I also really liked. That's more like blues, and it's like purples and blues more so. So it's like the same design, just like a purple blue look. I also really like the sort of like nighttimey version as well, but we went with the sort of bright color version because I think it just like stands out really well. Like it's one of those where like on a bookshelf or in a bookstore or whatever, it's like it really jumps out at
absolutely.
you. And
Yeah,
so I this was just she's just a phenomenal artist, and I think that this was just such a beautiful thing she put
truly
together.
captures the essence so well.
It does. It really does. There was a lot of, I definitely teared up. I think my editor cried. I think my agent cried. Several people cried.
So sweet.
Yeah, it was a lot of people were really into it. And they were like, this is so beautiful. And we're all like, yeah, this one really hit. It's really good.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's the
So
point of
are
art, right? To move us.
But sorry.
I said that's the point of art, right? To move us. So that was the
Exactly.
best. Yeah.
It was really perfect.
so are you working on anything right now? Are you somebody that like you're always writing?
I am very much working on something right now. I'm working on another book. It's due very soon. So I'm very much working on it. I am unsure of when it will be reaching readers at this time. I don't have like a sense of exactly its timeline of when it's reaching people, but what I say is that it is the thing that is constantly on my mind. It is the millstone around my neck at all times. I am very much working on it. It is very much happening. But I'm hope I personally deeply hope that it will be available to readers soon, because that means that I will be done with it soon. And
Yeah.
that means that I've made it through working on this thing, because I'm now at a stage where it's in the revision process. So it's no longer I'm past the sort of it's drafted, it's existed, it's in revisions at this time. And I think that as I'm working through the revision process, it can be a quite of a challenging process. And so I'm kind of in that stage of things, and I am very close to being it's like the perfect level of I'm so close and yet still just too far away on working on it. So that's basically what I'm spending every waking hour of my life doing that isn't spent, keeping myself alive or like
Yeah.
teaching or something like that. It's pretty much that I'm working on this thing or thinking about how I should be working on this thing, and like,
Feeling guilty.
lamenting to this. Yeah. It's a lot of that. My husband can attest to it. He's seen a lot of like, me just kind of like screaming at the sky and lamenting and being like, will I ever finish this thing? What have I done to myself? That sort of vibe.
I can't wait to read it. That's really exciting. Yeah.
Thank you. I am so excited for other people to have access to reading it. It will be great when it is published and it exists in the world. Oh man, I guess, yeah, that's where we're at. I'm like, it's funny when you're working in the depths of working on a book and you're sort of in this stage where you're like, is this thing good? Is this thing really good? Is this thing absolutely terrible? What have I done? Where am I? What's going on? Like, it's just a lot of confusion
Yeah.
and plaguing self-doubt, but then also trying to remind yourself that it actually might be really good and you just don't know because you're too tired. Um, it's a lot of it's that energy.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, I feel like there's a John Mulaney joke that I often go back to where he often says, like, he had some joke that was like, do all my friends hate me or do I just need to go to sleep? And I feel like writing a book is like, is this book terrible or do I just need to go to sleep? Is kind of the
Yeah.
vibe that I live my life in right now. That's sort of the energy that I'm often sitting in.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us and giving us your time. This was so cool to learn more about you and Junie.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was such a great conversation, and I love getting to, thank you so much for sharing Junie with
Oh, of
your
course.
community and all of that. I'm so appreciative.
Yeah, thank you so much. And maybe we can chat with you for the next book.
Exactly. Hopefully sooner rather than later.
So that you can rest easy.
Exactly. That's the hope.
Thank you, Erin.
All right. Thank
Thank
you so much. Have a
you.
good one.
You too.
All right.